The snow fell in a silent, suffocating blanket, draping the unforgiving spine of the Appalachian Mountains in a pristine, deadly white. It was January 1863, and the air was a blade, sharp and unforgiving, that cut to the bone. Sergeant Elijah Vance pulled his woolen collar tighter, a futile attempt against the biting wind. The small contingent of Union soldiers under his command had been on the move for 3 weeks, their boots heavy with mud and ice, their faces gaunt with fatigue. Their mission, to establish a hidden supply depot for a larger flanking maneuver, had seemed straightforward on paper. In the bitter reality of the mountains, it was a fool's errand. "Sergeant, we're not going to make it," a young private named Silas muttered, his breath a white plume in the frigid air. He was a farm boy from Ohio, and the sheer scale of the mountains, their brooding, silent presence, had unnerved him from the start. "We have to, Private," Vance replied, his voice a gravelly monotone. He was a man defined by the war, his youth stolen by the grit and grime of 100 small skirmishes. His eyes, the only part of him that seemed truly alive, scanned the tree line, a constant, weary vigilance. The woods here were different, thicker, older. They held secrets, and he felt their weight pressing down on him. They were following a faint, almost invisible trail, the kind that only locals would know. It led them deeper into a hollow, a dark scar carved into the mountainside. The trees, gnarled oaks and stoic pines, seemed to lean in, whispering. A prickle of unease ran down Vance's spine. It wasn't just the cold, it was something else, a feeling of being watched, a predator's gaze from the darkness. "Sergeant, look," another soldier, Corporal Davies, said, pointing a trembling finger. He was a seasoned veteran, but his face was pale. On the trunk of a great pine, scratched deep into the bark, was a symbol. It wasn't a military mark or a trail sign. It was a crude depiction of a bear, its eyes gouged out, its mouth a gaping, savage maw. Below it, a single word: ghost. Local superstition, Vance dismissed, but his voice lacked conviction. He had heard the whispers in the last few towns they had passed through. Stories of ghost bears, creatures that were not quite bear, not quite something else. They were said to be born of the war's violence, of the spilled blood, and the hatred festering in the mountains. They hunted not for food, but for the thrill of the kill, leaving behind mangled, unidentifiable corpses. He had dismissed it as campfire tales, the wild fictions of isolated paranoid folk. Now, seeing the symbol, a cold, hard knot of dread began to form in his gut. They pressed on, the silence of the forest broken only by the crunch of their boots on the snow and the ragged rhythm of their breathing. The trail opened into a small, secluded clearing. An old, dilapidated trapper's cabin stood in the center, a wisp of smoke curling from its crumbling chimney. This was their destination. It was smaller than he had hoped, more isolated, but it would have to do. "All right, boys, let's get this camp set up," Vance ordered, trying to inject some life into his weary voice. The men moved with a sluggish reluctance, their movements speaking of a defeat that had nothing to do with battle. Inside the cabin, it was dark and damp, smelling of decay and old smoke. A crude table, a rickety cot, and a cold fireplace were the only furnishings. Silas was tasked with getting a fire going, his hands shaking so much it took him several tries to light the kindling. Corporal Davies began to check the perimeter, his rifle held tight to his chest. Vance stepped back outside, the swirling snow a hypnotic dance around him. The feeling of being watched intensified, a heavy weight on his shoulders. He scanned the dense tree line, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom. He saw nothing, and yet he felt something. A presence. He turned to look at the cabin, his gaze catching on a small red stain on the snow near the front step. It was a recent mark, not dried. He knelt, brushing the snow away. It wasn't blood. It was a single berry, a bright crimson flash against the stark white. It didn't belong there. There were no berry bushes for miles. As he stood up, a low, guttural growl, impossibly close, rumbled from the woods behind him. It wasn't the sound of a bear, a deep and powerful force of nature. This was different. A sound of hunger and hate, a rattling, choked noise that was more human than animal. Vance froze, his hand on his holstered pistol. The sound came again, closer now, and a new sound accompanied it, a faint, rhythmic scratching, like claws on bark. The feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by the terrifying certainty of being hunted. He turned slowly, his eyes wide. The snow, which had been falling steadily, now seemed to stop, the world holding its breath. He saw a flicker of movement between the trees, a dark shape that was too fast, too low to the ground to be a man. It moved with a disturbing, disjointed gait. It wasn't a ghost, but it wasn't a bear either. It was something else, something born of the savage madness of war. He drew his pistol, the cold steel a small, inadequate comfort. "Davies, get back inside," he yelled, his voice a hoarse shout against the oppressive silence. The figure in the trees vanished, and the scratching sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, a heavy, suffocating weight. But then a new sound, faint but clear, drifted on the wind from the direction of the trail they had just taken. A woman's scream. It was a sound of pure terror, a high-pitched cry that tore through the quiet and echoed off the mountains. It was followed by a series of desperate, panicked shouts. And then, silence once more, broken only by the sound of the wind. Vance's mind reeled. They were alone out here. There was no one for miles. Who was screaming? And what had he just seen? He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the nightmare had just begun. The mountains held more than just cold and isolation. They held a terror that was waiting, and it was watching them, waiting for them to make a single mistake. And that mistake would be their last. He retreated into the cabin, slamming the heavy wooden door shut. The others looked at him, their faces a pale mosaic of fear. "Sergeant?" Silas whispered. Vance didn't answer. He simply went to the window, his eyes fixed on the tree line. The scratching sound had stopped. But he knew, with a horrifying, sinking feeling, that it hadn't gone away. It was just waiting. And the thing that had just screamed, its fate, was now their future. The ghosts of these mountains were not specters. They were something far more tangible and far more terrifying. And they were coming. The scream echoed in the hollow space of the cabin, an invisible specter of pure dread. Corporal Davies, his hands white-knuckled around his rifle, stared at Vance. "Sergeant, what was that?" "I don't know," Vance said, his voice clipped and low. He moved away from the window, the image of the fleeting shadow in the trees seared into his mind. "But whatever it was, it's out there, and it's not alone." The small group of soldiers, Vance, Davies, Silas, and two others, Private Carter and Private Thompson, huddled together. The warmth from the newly kindled fire was a small comfort, but it did little to chase away the cold dread that had taken root in their hearts. The cabin, once a symbol of refuge, now felt like a fragile cage. Hours passed in a tense, nerve-wracking silence. The blizzard intensified, the wind a mournful shriek against the wooden walls. The sound of something scraping against the roof, heavy and rhythmic, made everyone jump. Vance motioned for them to be quiet, their eyes wide with fear. The scratching continued, a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to mock their pathetic attempts at sanctuary. It sounded like a bear's claws, but it was too methodical, too intelligent. "It's on the roof, Sergeant," Thompson whispered, his face a mask of terror. "What is it?" "Just a bear," Vance lied, his own heart pounding against his ribs. The storm probably drove it to seek shelter. The lie was meant to reassure them, but it sounded hollow and unconvincing even to his own ears. He had seen the shadow in the trees. No bear moved like that. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the howling wind. Then came a new sound from outside, a wet, sloppy thumping against the wooden wall right next to the window. It was the sound of something large and heavy being thrown, a rhythmic beat against the cabin's flimsy structure. Davies crept to the window, his hand on the glass pane, his breath fogging the surface. He wiped it clear, peering out. His breath hitched in his throat. "Sergeant, you need to see this." Vance moved to his side, his gaze following Davies's trembling finger. A dark shape was visible in the swirling snow, a large, motionless form. It was a man, or what was left of one. His body was twisted into a grotesque, unnatural position, his limbs bent at impossible angles. His uniform was tattered, and his face, what they could see of it, was a grotesque, bloody pulp. But the most horrifying detail was what lay on the snow next to him. A small, ragged doll, its button eyes staring up at the stormy sky. That's one of ours," Thompson stammered, his voice a disbelieving gasp. "A scout. Sergeant Miller's group. They were a week ahead of us. But this wasn't a battlefield death. This was a violation. The body hadn't been killed. It had been mangled. The doll, a small personal item, was a sick, deliberate taunt. "They're playing with us," Silas whispered, his face green. "The ghost bears. They're real." Vance didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in the malevolent cruelty of men. This was a message, a declaration of intent. Someone or something was out there, using the local legends as a cover. "Secure the cabin," Vance ordered, his mind racing. "Barricade the doors and windows. No one goes out, not for any reason." The men, galvanized by the immediate threat, went to work, their movements a frantic ballet of fear. They dragged the heavy table to the door, shoved the rickety cot against a window, and used whatever loose boards they could find to reinforce the flimsy walls. As they worked, the thumping sound began again, but this time it was louder, faster. The snow outside was now a crimson canvas, a gruesome art installation of death. Another body was thrown against the wall, then another. They were all soldiers from Miller's contingent. Their bodies were disfigured in a sickeningly similar manner, and with each corpse, a small personal belonging, a letter, a watch, a small wooden cross, was carefully laid out in the snow. The psychological warfare was more terrifying than a direct attack. The enemy, whoever or whatever they were, was not a wild beast driven by hunger. This was an act of cold, calculated sadism. "They're mocking us," Davies said, his voice cracking. "They're showing us what's coming." Vance grabbed his rifle, loading a round with a sharp click. "Stay away from the windows. Don't look at it," he said, but his own eyes were drawn to the gruesome tableau outside. Meanwhile, a few miles away, in a more substantial cabin nestled deeper in the hollow, a small family was experiencing their own night of terror. The McAllisters, a stern-faced patriarch named Jacob, his frail wife Sarah, and their young daughter Mary, were huddled by the fire, their faces lit by the flickering flames. They had heard the whispers of the ghost bears, but they had always dismissed them as tall tales. Now, their own nightmare had begun. The patriarch, Jacob, was a hard man, a former Confederate sympathizer who had refused to join the fight, a decision that had ostracized him from both sides. He had seen strange things in the woods in the past few weeks, animal traps sprung with no prey. His small flock of sheep found slaughtered, not eaten, their throats slit with surgical precision. And the strange guttural sounds at night, sounds that were too deep to be a man, too human to be an animal. Tonight, a violent scratching had started on their roof, a rhythmic, maddening sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Mary, their daughter, clutched a small cloth doll to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "It's just the wind, Mary," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She looked at her husband, her eyes pleading for a reassurance he couldn't give. Jacob went to the window, the same sense of primal dread that Vance was feeling settling over him. He peered out, his breath fogging the glass. In the distance, through the swirling snow, he saw a dark shape moving toward their cabin, a hunched figure moving with a disturbing, loping gait. It was carrying something in its arms. He squinted, his heart sinking into his stomach. The figure stopped at the edge of the tree line and with a disturbingly casual motion threw the object toward their cabin. It landed with a soft thud in the snow just beyond their porch. Jacob swallowed hard, his face a mask of sick realization. It wasn't an animal, it was a man. But the way he moved, the sound he made, something was terribly wrong. He looked at his family, at his terrified daughter clinging to her doll. He knew, with a horrifying certainty, that the thing outside had just been a scout. And the main force, the true horror, was on its way. The silence that followed was broken by a soft, almost imperceptible sound of breaking glass from the back of the cabin. The thing that had thrown the body hadn't come to kill. It had come to announce its arrival, and its message was clear. There was no escaping the ghost bears. The sound of shattering glass from the back of the cabin was a cold dagger to Jacob's heart. He spun around, his shotgun clutched in his shaking hands. The back window, long since boarded up, had been breached, not by force but by a delicate, deliberate act. A single pane of glass was missing, and the board covering it had been pulled aside. "Jacob, what was that?" Sarah cried, her voice thin with terror. "Stay back," he warned, his eyes darting to the black opening. The wind howled through the broken window, carrying with it a new, sickly scent. The cloying smell of old blood and something else, something fetid and unnatural. Mary, their young daughter, began to sob, her small frame shaking. Jacob's heart ached for her, for the innocence that was being stripped away by this creeping dread. He felt a primal rage, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He would protect his family, no matter the cost. He crept toward the back room, his shotgun raised. The wind moaned through the gap in the window. He peered into the darkness but saw nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a suffocating presence. He aimed his shotgun at the dark window frame, his finger trembling on the trigger. He wasn't afraid of a bear or a man. He was afraid of the thing that was out there, the thing that seemed to be playing with them. A rhythmic scratching started again, but this time it was from inside the cabin. He froze. The sound was coming from the attic, a low, deliberate scuttling. It was a sound that had no right to be there. He knew the attic was empty, just a dusty storage space. What could be up there? He lowered his shotgun, his mind reeling. The broken window, the sound in the attic. This wasn't a random attack. This was a psychological assault designed to break their will before the real attack began. Meanwhile, back in the soldiers' cabin, the men were on the brink of a breakdown. The sight of their fellow soldiers' bodies, mangled and displayed like macabre trophies, had shattered their morale. The rhythmic thumping had stopped, but the psychological wounds were just beginning to fester. "Sergeant, we have to get out of here," Thompson pleaded, his eyes wide and wild. "We can't fight what we can't see." "We can't go out there," Vance said, his voice flat. "The storm will kill us, and if it doesn't, whatever did that will." He pointed a trembling finger at the window. "We stay here. We defend this cabin until the storm breaks. We're soldiers, not animals." But the line between the two was blurring fast. The men, their faces etched with fear, began to argue amongst themselves. Silas, the youngest, began to weep quietly, his body shaking. "They're not animals, Sergeant," he sobbed. "I saw them. They looked like men, but they moved like beasts. They had those masks. They were wearing something. I swear to God, they were laughing. Vance's head snapped up. Masks? What are you talking about, Silas? Silas, emboldened by his terror, spoke in a rush. Before we got here a few miles back, I saw them. They were in the trees. They had these crude masks, like bears' faces, made of animal hide. Their eyes were human. But they moved. They crawled on all fours like bears. They were fast, unnaturally fast. A cold, hard truth began to crystallize in Vance's mind. It wasn't a legend. It was a group of men using a local superstition to create a psychological weapon. But why? Who were they? And why were they hunting them with such calculated cruelty? It's a trap, Vance muttered to himself, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This isn't about the war. It's about something else. The supply depot. It's a diversion. They knew we were coming. The scratching on the roof began again, a more frantic, faster sound this time. The thumping on the walls resumed, louder and more insistent. It was a coordinated attack. They weren't just playing anymore, they were trying to break in. Thompson, his mind finally snapping, grabbed his rifle and ran to the door. "I'm not going to die like that," he screamed. "I'd rather face the storm." "Thompson, no," Vance roared, but it was too late. Thompson fumbled with the makeshift barricade, a wild look in his eyes. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound from outside was followed by a sharp, panicked scream from Thompson. A large tree branch, dislodged by the wind, had crashed through the roof, a jagged spear of wood impaling him through the shoulder, pinning him to the barricaded door. He let out a gurgling cry, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and horror. Vance and Davies rushed to him, trying to free him, but the weight of the branch was immense. As they struggled, a low, guttural growl echoed from the hole in the roof, a sound that made their blood run cold. They looked up, their eyes fixed on the ragged opening. A face, grotesque and terrifying, peered down at them through the gloom. It was a man's face, but it was contorted into a snarl, and its features were obscured by a crude, stitched-together mask of a bear's head. Its eyes, burning with a savage hatred, were human. "They're inside," Thompson gurgled, blood bubbling from his lips. "They're here." The masked figure in the roof let out a low, mocking laugh, a sound that was more terrifying than any growl. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. The ghost bears were not creatures of legend. They were men, driven by a hatred so profound it had warped them into something monstrous. And they were now inside the cabin. The masked figure in the roof was a grotesque apparition, a living nightmare stitched together from man and beast. It was not a single entity, but a person, their face a canvas of hate and madness. The crudely fashioned bear mask, made from the hide of some animal, distorted the human features into something monstrous. Its eyes, glinting in the dim light of the cabin, were the most horrifying part. They were filled with a cunning intelligence and a deep-seated malice. Vance and Davies, frozen in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror, stared up at the figure. The man, Thompson, was gasping, his breath a ragged whisper. The branch that impaled him was a testament to the brutal, calculated power of the ghost bears. "Who are you?" Vance demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to keep it steady. He aimed his pistol at the figure, but a wave of dizzying nausea washed over him. The air in the cabin had grown heavy, thick with the cloying scent of something bitter and sweet. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it let out a low, rattling chuckle and began to lower itself through the hole in the roof, its movements eerily fluid. It moved with a disturbing, disjointed grace, like an animal that had been taught to walk on its hind legs. Its limbs were long and thin, its back hunched. It was emaciated, its frame gaunt with what looked like starvation. The figure was a person, but it had been stripped of its humanity, a ghost of its former self. "Get back!" Davies screamed, but his voice was drowned out by a sickening crunch. The figure had landed on the floor of the cabin, its weight surprisingly light. It was on all fours, its head cocked to the side, its eyes fixed on them. It was a man, a human being, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. As the ghost bear began to crawl toward them, its movements unsettlingly quick, Vance felt his head spin. He looked at the fire, and the world seemed to warp. The flames danced in a strange, hypnotic rhythm, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. He looked at his men. Silas was clutching his stomach, a pale green. Carter was on the floor, his body shaking violently. What did they do? Vance gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. What is in the air? The masked figure stopped its crawl, its head still cocked. It made a sound, a high-pitched, mocking giggle that was more chilling than any roar. It raised a hand, a long, thin appendage with dirt-caked nails, and pointed to a small bundle it had dropped from the roof. Davies, his eyes wide with fear and confusion, stumbled toward the bundle. He knelt, his hands fumbling to open it. Inside, nestled on a pile of old leaves, were a few dried red berries. The same berries Vance had seen on the snow outside. He brought one to his nose and recoiled. The smell was sweet, but beneath it was a bitter, acrid tang. "Jimson weed," Davies whispered, his voice a disbelieving gasp. "They burned Jimson weed in the fire. It's an old mountain trick, a hallucinogen. We're all poisoned." Vance's mind reeled. The nausea, the hallucinations, the sense of unreality. It all made sense. They hadn't been seeing things. They had been made to see things. The screaming woman, the strange shadow in the woods, it had all been a carefully orchestrated psychological attack, a way to make them doubt their own senses. The ghost bear watched them, its head still cocked to the side as if enjoying their confusion. It began to speak, its voice a low, raspy croak. "The mountains, they have their own laws. No one comes here. You are not welcome." Vance, his mind fighting to stay sane, aimed his pistol at the figure. "Who are you?" The figure reached up, its long, bony fingers fumbling with the strings of the mask. It pulled the headpiece off, revealing a face that was more horrifying than the mask itself. It was the face of a man, gaunt and haggard, with a wild, fanatical glint in his eyes. His skin was pale and sallow, and his lips were chapped and cracked. He was a mountain man, a local, but there was a deep-seated madness in his eyes that had nothing to do with isolation. "We are the ghost bears," he said, his voice a low, manic whisper. "We are what the war has left behind." Just as the man spoke, a loud crash from the other side of the cabin made everyone jump. The front door, weakened by Thompson's struggle and the constant pounding from the outside, had given way. A second figure, also masked, stormed in, followed by a third. They were not alone. There was a small, silent army of them, all wearing the same grotesque bear masks, all emaciated and moving with a horrifying, animal-like grace. They weren't a regiment or a militia. They were a group of men who had been driven to the very brink of humanity and beyond. They had been using the local legend to cover their tracks, to drive their victims to madness before the kill. The bodies of the soldiers outside. It was a message, a promise, and the promise was a horrible, brutal death. Vance, his mind clearing for a fleeting moment, knew he had to act. He didn't have to fight a ghost, he had to fight a man. A group of men, driven to a desperate, unhinged state. This was not a war of nations, but a war of survival. The true horror was not what was in the mask, but what was behind it. And that was the horror he had to face. While the soldiers were succumbing to their psychological torment, the McAllisters faced a more immediate and equally horrifying threat. Jacob, still gripping his shotgun, had seen the hunched figure carrying the soldier's body toward his cabin, a gruesome portent of what was to come. He'd heard the scuttling sound in his attic, and the sickening feeling of being hunted had settled in his bones. He crept to the attic entrance, his shotgun raised. The scuttling sound had stopped. The air in the cabin was thick with dread. He glanced back at his wife and daughter. Sarah, her face pale, was holding Mary close, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. He couldn't leave them. He had to face whatever was up there. He had to protect his family. He pushed the small trap door open, his heart pounding in his chest. The attic was pitch black, a silent void. He reached up, feeling for the string to the oil lamp he kept stored up there. His fingers brushed against something soft and cold, something that didn't belong. He pulled his hand back, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. A low, guttural moan came from the darkness above. It was a human sound, but it was twisted by pain and starvation. A small, ragged hand, caked with dirt, reached down from the blackness and wrapped itself around his wrist. Jacob let out a cry of surprise and yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the attic entrance. The hand, impossibly weak, let go. A sickening thud echoed from the attic floor, followed by a series of whimpers and coughs. A human. It was a human. Not a beast, but a human that had been reduced to a pathetic, starving thing. He raised his shotgun again, his mind racing. Who was up there? And why were they there? He aimed his gun at the opening, his finger on the trigger. He heard the rustling of fabric, the scraping of a boot. Someone was trying to climb down. "Jacob, what is it?" Sarah cried, her voice laced with fear. "Stay back," he yelled, his eyes fixed on the trapdoor. A figure began to emerge from the blackness, a hunched, emaciated form. It was a man, dressed in tattered, homespun clothes. He was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and vacant. His arms were covered in a series of strange, intricate scars, as if someone had carved symbols into his flesh. He moved with a disturbing, disjointed gait, a puppet on a string. "He's been hurt, Jacob," Sarah said, her maternal instincts overcoming her fear. "He needs help." But Jacob was a man of the mountains. He had seen what desperation could do to a man, the vacant look in the man's eyes. There was no sanity there. This was a man who had been broken, either by starvation or by something far worse. The man in the attic let out another moan, a low, sorrowful sound. He took another step forward, his eyes fixed on the little girl, Mary, who was still clutching her doll. He wasn't looking at her with malice. He was looking at her with a sick, desperate hunger. Not for food, for something else, something human. Suddenly, a loud crash from the front of the cabin made everyone jump. The front door was being hammered from the outside. The sounds were too loud, too violent to be a man's fists. It was the ghost bears. The man from the attic, his eyes wide and panicked, turned and scurried back into the blackness, a terrified animal retreating to its lair. He was afraid of the things outside. He was one of their victims. Jacob knew he had a choice to make. He could try to fight the things outside, or he could try to save the man inside. But the hammering on the door was getting louder, and the wood was beginning to splinter. He had to act, and he had to act now. He grabbed his axe, his face grim. "Sarah, take Mary and hide in the cellar. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. I'll hold them off." "Jacob, no!" Sarah cried, but he had already made up his mind. He was a man of peace, but peace had been taken from him. Now he would fight. Meanwhile, back at the soldiers' cabin, the situation had deteriorated into a horrifying, drug-fueled chaos. The men, poisoned by the Jimson weed, were lost in their own private hells. Silas was on the floor, weeping and screaming about phantom spiders crawling all over his skin. Carter was huddled in a corner, his body shaking uncontrollably, his eyes darting around the room as if seeing 100 things that weren't there. The ghost bears, their masks removed, were a horrifying vision of human desperation. They were emaciated, their eyes burning with a manic hunger. They moved with a disturbing animal-like grace, their movements a horrifying imitation of the beasts they pretended to be. The leader, the man with the wild eyes and the cruel smile, walked slowly toward Vance, his hands raised in a gesture of mock surrender. "This is not your war, soldier," he said, his voice a low, raspy croak. "This is our land, our war. The ghost bears are not beasts, they are a warning." Vance, his own mind swimming in a sea of hallucination, aimed his pistol at the man. "What do you want?" "We want our land back," the man said, a sick hunger in his eyes. "We want the bounty that the war has promised. We want the weapons, the supplies, and the retribution for what the war has done to us." The ghost bears were not a random force. They were an organized group, a cult of sorts, who had been driven to the very edge of sanity by the harsh realities of the war. They had been left behind, forgotten by both sides, and they had forged their own kind of twisted justice, preying on those who wandered into their territory. The man raised his hands, and his followers, a silent, menacing group, began to circle around the soldiers, their movements a terrifying ballet of starvation and hate. "The ghost bears. They eat souls, soldier," the leader whispered, his voice a sick, sibilant hiss. "They consume the humanity of a man, leaving only the hunger behind. And we're so hungry." The true horror of the situation was not that they were being hunted by a monster. The horror was that the monster was a man, a human being who had been broken, driven to a state of primal savagery. And that was a truth more terrifying than any legend. The sickening sound of splintering wood filled the McAllister cabin as the ghost bears began to break through the front door. Jacob, his axe raised, stood firm, a solitary figure against a tide of madness. His wife and daughter were in the cellar, and he would die before he let these creatures get to them. The door burst inward, sending a shower of splinters across the floor. The first figure to enter was a hunched, masked man, his eyes glinting with a feral cruelty. It was the same one Jacob had seen outside, the one who had thrown the soldier's body. He moved with a disturbing loping gait, his shoulders hunched, his hands dangling low. Jacob swung his axe, a desperate, wild blow. The ghost bear dodged with a sickening, animal-like speed, a low chuckle escaping its lips. It was a sound that made Jacob's skin crawl. "Don't fight, old man," the figure rasped, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "It's no use. The mountains have claimed you." Meanwhile, back at the soldier's cabin, the hallucinogenic effects of the Jimson weed were beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, numbing clarity. Vance, his head still swimming, saw the ghost bears for what they truly were. Not monsters, but men. Gaunt, starving, and driven to a state of primal madness. Their masks were a psychological weapon, their actions a calculated display of power. The leader, his face now unmasked, stood before them, his arms crossed. "You came for supplies. We'll give you supplies," he said, a sick smile on his lips. "We'll give you what's left of us." Vance, fighting through the lingering haze, noticed something else. The men were not just emaciated. They were also covered in small, deep cuts and bruises. They had been fighting among themselves. Their group was not a unified force. It was a collection of desperate, unhinged individuals held together by a single, terrifying purpose. "What do you want?" Vance asked again, his voice firming. He had to buy time. He had to figure out a way out of this hell. "We want revenge," the leader said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "for what your war has done to our land. For the soldiers you sent here, who took our food, our land, our families. We want it all back." Vance's mind raced. This was not a random attack. It was a localized war, a conflict born of desperation and vengeance. The ghost bears were not just murderers. They were survivors, their humanity stripped away by the very war they were now fighting against. Suddenly, A series of frantic, panicked barks echoed from the tree line. The sound was followed by the low, guttural snarls of a pack of wild dogs. The ghost bears turned, their eyes wide with fear. They weren't afraid of the soldiers. They were afraid of something else. "The hounds," the leader of the ghost bears whispered, his face pale. "They found us." Vance was confused. The hounds? What were they? He didn't have time to think. The dogs, a lean, starved pack of canines, burst from the tree line, their eyes glinting in the snow. They were not domesticated dogs. They were wild, feral things, their teeth bared in a savage snarl. The ghost bears scattered, their animal-like grace turning into a panicked flight. They weren't the only ones hunting in these mountains. They were being hunted as well. The leader, his face contorted in a mask of fear, looked back at Vance. "We'll be back," he rasped, his eyes filled with a new kind of terror. "This isn't over." Vance watched, stunned, as the ghost bears vanished into the snowy landscape, their panicked cries echoing in the distance. The dogs, however, did not follow. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their eyes fixed on the cabin, their barks a low, menacing warning. The men, their minds still reeling from the hallucinogen, were on the floor, their bodies shaking. Vance was the only one who seemed to have a grasp on reality. He knew he had to act. He had to get his men out of there. But where could they go? The mountains were a death trap, filled with men who had gone mad, and with something else, the hounds, that was even more terrifying. Meanwhile, at the McAllister cabin, Jacob had managed to fend off the first attack. He had used the splintered door as a shield, forcing the ghost bears back into the blizzard. But they were still outside, and he knew they would be back. He looked around the cabin, his eyes fixed on the empty spot where the man from the attic had been. He was gone. He heard a low whimper from the cellar, and his heart ached. He was trapped. There was no way out. He had to protect his family. He had to find a way to fight back. Suddenly, a new sound came from outside. A low, rhythmic scratching. But it wasn't the sound of the ghost bears. It was a lighter, more delicate sound like claws on wood. He looked out the window, his heart sinking. A pack of dogs, their fur matted with ice and snow, were sniffing at the ground, their eyes fixed on the cabin. The hounds had found them. Jacob knew with a horrifying certainty that he was caught in the middle of a war he didn't understand. The ghost bears were one kind of monster, the hounds were another. And he was just a man, trying to protect his family in a world that had gone mad. He heard a low, raspy whisper from outside, a disembodied voice carried on the wind. "The mountains, they have their own teeth, and they are very, very hungry." The words were a cruel, cold promise. He was surrounded. He was trapped. And the true horror was only just beginning. The blizzard raged on, a white tempest that seemed to devour all sound and hope. Vance and his remaining men, Davies, Silas, and Carter, were huddled in the ruined cabin, their bodies shaking from cold and lingering terror. The hallucinogenic effects of the Jimson weed had worn off, leaving them with a cold, clear, and utterly terrifying understanding of their situation. "They're not bears," Silas whispered, his voice a broken thing. "They're just men. But they're mad." "They're a cult," Vance corrected, his mind piecing together the horrifying puzzle. "Driven to the edge by starvation and isolation. They're using the legend to make us believe they're something they're not. It's psychological warfare." But the question remained, who were they, and why had they chosen to make this remote, God-forsaken hollow their lair? A new threat loomed outside. The hounds. The wild dogs had retreated from the immediate vicinity of the cabin, but Vance could hear their distant barks, a constant menacing presence in the howling wind. They were not just a pack of wild animals, they were something more, a force that even the ghost bears feared. "Sergeant, what are we gonna do?" Carter asked, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading look. "We can't stay here. They'll be back. We can't go out there." Vance's mind was a whirlwind of thought. He had to get them out of here. He had to find a way to survive. His eyes scanned the cabin, searching for a way out, for a sign, for anything. He noticed a loose floorboard in a corner of the cabin, a piece of wood that was slightly raised, as if someone had pried it open and then put it back in a hurry. He knelt, his fingers prying at the wood. Underneath the floorboard was a small, hidden space. Inside, he found a battered journal and a small leather pouch. The journal was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was a careful, deliberate cursive. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first few lines. It was a diary belonging to a man named Jedediah, a trapper who had once lived in this very cabin. The entries in the journal chronicled a terrifying descent into madness. Jedediah spoke of a sickness that was spreading through the mountains, a madness that was driving men to a state of primal savagery. He spoke of his neighbors, good men and women, who had begun to act strangely, their eyes vacant, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. He wrote of strange sounds in the night, of a low, guttural howl that was not a wolf's. He spoke of the ghost bears as a myth, but a myth with a chillingly real origin. Jedediah had discovered something, a secret. He had found a cave, a hidden lair deep in the mountains, a place where the ghost bears were keeping a cache of something they had stolen. But before he could reveal what it was, the journal abruptly ended. The last entry was a frantic, terrified scrawl. "The hounds. They have found me. They're not a myth. They're real. They're their guardians." Vance's blood ran cold. The ghost bears were not just a group of men. They were a part of a larger, more sinister scheme. They were a front, a tool for something else. And the hounds, they were the key. He looked at the small leather pouch. He opened it, his fingers fumbling. Inside he found a handful of small black beans. They were dried and shriveled, but he recognized them. They were wild castor beans, a powerful, deadly poison. He looked at the men, his mind reeling. The ghost bears weren't just starving. They were also being drugged, poisoned, and controlled. The Jimson weed had been a psychological weapon, but the poison, that was a tool of control. The ghost bears were not in charge of their own madness. They were being manipulated. "We have to go," Vance said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "Now. We have to find that cave." The men, their eyes wide with a new kind of fear, looked at him. They were trapped, but now they had a target. They had a purpose. They had a chance to fight back against the true source of the horror. Meanwhile, back at the McAllister cabin, Jacob had managed to hold off the ghost bears for a few precious hours. But they were relentless. He could hear their low growls and frantic movements outside, a constant menacing threat. He knew he couldn't hold out much longer. He heard a soft sound from the cellar. A small voice. "Daddy, is it safe?" His heart ached. He wanted to tell her yes, but he couldn't. He had to protect her. He had to find a way out. He crept to the cellar door, his axe held ready. He had to get his family out of here. But as he reached for the latch, a low, ominous growl came from behind him. He spun around, his shotgun raised. The man from the attic, the emaciated, scarred figure, was standing in the doorway to the back room. He was holding something in his hand, a small black stone. "They're coming for the prize," the man rasped, his eyes vacant and empty. "They're coming for her." He was looking at Mary, his eyes filled with a sick, desperate hunger that had nothing to do with food. Jacob, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion, knew he had to act. He had to protect his family. He raised his shotgun, his hands trembling. He had to save his daughter. But what was the prize? And who were they? The answers, he knew, lay in the journal that Vance had found, a story of an unholy alliance that was waiting to be uncovered. The snow had begun to thin, but the darkness that enveloped the mountains was absolute. Vance, clutching the journal and the pouch of castor beans, led his men from the ruined cabin, their movements silent and swift. Their fear had been replaced by a grim determination. They were no longer victims, they were on a mission. They had to find the cave, the source of this madness, and they had to find it before the ghost bears returned. The hounds were their new guides, their barks a constant menacing sound in the distance. They were following the same trail the ghost bears had taken. Vance had an inkling of what was happening. The dogs weren't just wild. They were a part of the Ghost Bear organization, a pack of enforcers, or perhaps something more. "Sergeant, look," Davies whispered, pointing a trembling finger. In the snow, a trail of footprints, surprisingly human, led into the woods. But they were not normal footprints. They were long, slender and deep, as if the person had been moving on all fours, their hands and feet a blur of motion. "They're not wearing shoes," Silas stammered, his eyes wide. Vance nodded grimly. The Ghost Bears were not just a cult. They were an organization, a small fanatical army that had been stripped of their humanity and reduced to something feral. They had abandoned all pretense of civilization. As they pressed on, the hounds' barks grew louder, more frantic. They were getting closer. Vance could see the tree line ahead, a dark, foreboding mass against the night sky. He saw a flicker of movement, a dark shape moving with a disturbing, loping gait. It was a ghost bear, a scout, their eyes glinting in the dark. But then a low rumbling growl came from the right, and the ghost bear froze, its body rigid with fear. A large, dark shape, a dog, emerged from the tree line, its eyes fixed on the ghost bear. It was not just a dog. It was a mastiff, a massive, powerful beast, its teeth bared in a snarl. "It's not just a pack of dogs," Davies whispered. "They're trained. They're bred for this. They're war dogs." The ghost bear, its face contorted in a mask of sheer terror, let out a pathetic whimper and began to crawl away. But the dog was faster. It leaped, its powerful jaws closing around the ghost bear's neck. There was a sickening crunch, a short, muffled scream, and then silence. Vance and his men watched in stunned silence. The hounds were not just a threat to them, they were a threat to the ghost bears. They were part of a larger, more horrifying story. They pressed on, the journal held tight in Vance's hand. He knew he had to get to the cave. He had to find the source of this madness. He had to find out what was going on in these mountains, a madness that had consumed men and turned them into beasts. Meanwhile, back at the McAllister cabin, Jacob was in a desperate struggle for survival. He had managed to hold off the ghost bears outside, but the man from the attic, the scarred, emaciated figure, was a new, more horrifying threat. He was not a fighter. He was something else. A decoy. A pawn. "What do you want?" Jacob demanded, his shotgun raised. The man from the attic just stared at him, his vacant eyes fixed on Mary. "The prize," he whispered, his voice a low, raspy croak. "The prize. They're coming for the prize." Jacob looked at his daughter, his heart pounding in his chest. What was the prize? And why would they want a little girl? He didn't have time to think. The man from the attic lunged, his body moving with a surprising, desperate speed. He wasn't trying to hurt Jacob, he was trying to get past him. Jacob swung his shotgun, a wild, desperate blow. The man fell back, his head hitting the wall with a sickening thud. He was dazed, but not out. He began to crawl toward the cellar door, a single, horrifying purpose in his eyes. He wasn't after Jacob, he was after his daughter. Jacob, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion, realized the truth. The man from the attic wasn't a ghost bear. He was a victim. He had been sent to distract Jacob, to act as a diversion while the real threat, the true horror, made its move. Suddenly, a loud crash from the back of the cabin made him jump. The back door, which he had not had time to barricade, had been broken through. A figure, masked and hunched, entered the cabin. It was not a man. It was a woman, her frame small and slender, her eyes filled with a cold, malevolent fury. "Where is she?" she demanded, her voice a low, raspy whisper. She was a ghost bear, but she was different. She was not a starving, emaciated shell. She was a warrior, a hunter. Jacob realized the horrifying truth. The ghost bears were not just a cult. They were a family, a clan, driven to the edge by war and desperation. And they had been hunting them for something more than just supplies. They were hunting them for a prize. And that prize was his daughter. He had to protect her. He had to fight. He raised his shotgun, his hands trembling. He was just a man. But he would fight like a monster to protect his family. The true horror was not what was in the masks, but what was behind them. A family that had been warped by war into something terrifying and inhuman. The path to the cave was a grim pilgrimage through a landscape of death and desperation. Vance and his men followed the tracks, the occasional discarded bear mask or tattered piece of clothing, a testament to the ghost bear's flight. The hounds were a constant presence, their barks a menacing guide through the silent, oppressive cold. "Look, Sergeant," Davies whispered, pointing. They had reached a small, rocky outcrop. Lying in the snow were several of the ghost bears, their bodies twisted in grotesque, unnatural positions. Their throats had been torn out, their bodies mangled and clawed. The work of the hounds. Vance's heart sank. This wasn't a coordinated assault, this was a purge. The hounds were culling the ghost bears. But why? What was the purpose of this horrifying display of brutality? They found the cave at the base of a sheer rock face, hidden from view by a thicket of gnarled pines. The entrance was a narrow, dark opening, the air around it heavy with the stench of decay and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that was both sickening and familiar. "Jimson weed." "Stay here," Vance ordered, his voice low and serious. "I'm going in." "Sergeant, no," Silas pleaded, his face pale. "It's a trap." "It's a trap we have to walk into," Vance said, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. "We have to find out what's in there. We have to end this." He entered the cave, his pistol raised, the journal clutched in his other hand. The cave was a warren of narrow tunnels and small, damp chambers. The stench of decay was overwhelming. He found the source of the smell, a pile of bones, bleached and picked clean. They weren't animal bones. They were human. Vance's blood ran cold. The ghost bears weren't just a cult. They were cannibals. They had been eating the soldiers, the trappers, the families who had wandered into their territory. The madness was a result of starvation and a depraved cannibalistic diet. He pressed on, his mind reeling. He heard a sound ahead, a low, rhythmic moan. He followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He came to a small, open chamber. In the center, a fire burned, its light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. And in the shadows, he saw them, the ghost bears. A small, pathetic group of them, huddled around the fire. They were not menacing. They were starved, emaciated shells, their eyes vacant and empty. The leader, the man with the wild eyes, was sitting in the middle of them, his head in his hands. He was weeping. "It's not what you think," the leader said, his voice a low, broken sob. "We didn't want this." Vance was confused. He lowered his pistol. "What do you mean?" "The war, it took everything," the leader said, his voice a pathetic whisper. "Our homes, our crops, our families. We were starving. We were left for dead. And then they came. They offered us a deal." Vance's mind raced. "Who?" "The hounds." the leader said, a look of pure terror on his face. Not the dogs, the man who leads them. He came to us. He offered us food. He offered us power. He offered us vengeance. The man, the leader of the hounds, was not a monster. He was a man. A cruel, sadistic man who had found a group of desperate, starving people and had offered them a deal with the devil. He had given them the Jimson weed, the castor beans. He had taught them to be ghost bears, to hunt, to kill, to act like animals. He told us to hunt soldiers, to hunt families, the leader said, his voice a broken thing. He told us to bring him the children. He told us the children were the prize. Vance's blood ran cold. The ghost bears were not the true monsters. They were victims. They were pawns in a sick game. The true monster was the man who had created them, the man who was using them to fulfill some twisted, horrifying desire. And that desire was to collect the children. He turned to leave, his mind reeling. He had to get to the McAllisters. He had to warn them. He had to save them. He had to stop the true monster. But as he turned, a cold voice came from the shadows. "Going so soon, soldier?" a voice said, low and smooth. A man emerged from the darkness. He was tall, well-dressed, his face clean-shaven, his eyes dark and cold. He was not a mountain man. He was a man of power, a man of money. He was the leader of the hounds, and he was the true monster. "You found our little secret," the man said, a sick smile on his lips, "and now you have to die for it." Meanwhile, back at the McAllister cabin, Jacob was fighting a losing battle. The woman Ghost Bear, a true warrior, had managed to get past him. She was now in the cellar, fighting with Sarah. He heard a crash, a scream, and then a low, desperate plea. He ran to the cellar, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw the woman, her eyes filled with a cold, malevolent fury, standing over Sarah, a small black stone clutched in her hand. Mary was huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. "The prize," the woman said, her voice a low, triumphant hiss. "She is the prize." Jacob, his mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation, knew he had to act. He had to save his daughter. He was just a man, but he would fight like a demon to protect her. The true horror was not what was in the masks, but what was behind them, a cold, calculating evil that was 1,000 times more terrifying than any myth. The man, the leader of the hounds, stood before Vance, a chilling smile on his face. "The war has given me an opportunity, Sergeant," he said, his voice as smooth and cold as the ice on the mountains. "People go missing. Families disappear. No one looks too hard in a time of war." Vance's mind raced. This was not a random act of violence. It was a business, a horrifying business of human trafficking, a cruel, cold enterprise that preyed on the desperation of a nation at war. The ghost bears were just the foot soldiers, the pawns in a much larger, more sinister game. The children, they were the cargo, the prize. "You're a monster," Vance said, his voice a low growl. "No, Sergeant," the man corrected, his eyes glinting. "I'm a pragmatist. I simply saw a market, and I exploited it. The ghost bears were my invention, a convenient myth to hide the truth." Vance raised his pistol, his hands steady. He didn't care about the war anymore. He didn't care about Union or Confederacy. All he cared about was ending this man's reign of terror. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, a loud, panicked cry came from the entrance of the cave. The ghost bears, the starved, broken men and women, were running toward them, their eyes wide with a new kind of terror. The hounds, the true ones, the war dogs, were attacking them. They were culling the herd. "A necessary evil," the man said, a look of calm amusement on his face. "The wild dogs are a great way to tie up loose ends." Vance had to act. He didn't have to fight the man. He had to fight the system he had created. He had to expose the truth. He fired his pistol, not at the man, but at a wooden beam supporting the cave roof. The shot echoed through the cave, a loud, violent sound. The beam, already weakened by the cold and damp, splintered and broke. The ceiling of the cave began to crumble, a cascade of rocks and dirt. The man, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, turned to run, but it was too late. The cave collapsed, burying the man and his horrifying secret beneath a mountain of rubble. Vance, a look of grim satisfaction on his face, ran from the collapsing cave, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get back to the McAllisters. He had to warn them. He had to save them. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Jacob was in a desperate struggle for his life. The woman Ghost Bear had managed to get past him and was now in the cellar. He heard a crash, a scream, and then silence. He ran to the cellar, his axe raised. He was prepared to fight. But when he entered the cellar, he saw a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The woman, her face a mask of primal fury, was kneeling over Sarah's unconscious body. Mary was cowering in a corner, her eyes wide with terror. "The prize," the woman hissed, a look of triumph on her face. "She's coming with me." Jacob, his mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation, knew he had to act. He threw his axe, a wild, desperate throw. The axe hit the woman in the shoulder, a sickening thud. She let out a cry of pain, her hands going to her wound. Jacob lunged, his body a blur of motion. He grabbed his daughter, pulling her into a tight, protective embrace. The woman, her eyes filled with a new kind of hate, pulled the axe from her shoulder, her hands trembling with fury. But then, a new sound came from the front of the cabin, the sound of a door being kicked in. Vance, his face grim and determined, entered the cabin, his pistol raised. The woman Ghost Bear saw him, and a look of pure, unadulterated fear crossed her face. "He's dead," she whispered, her eyes wide. "He can't be." Vance didn't answer. He simply aimed his pistol at her. The woman, a look of defeat on her face, dropped the axe and ran, a panicked, desperate flight into the snow. She was a monster, but she was also a victim. And now, she was just a woman, alone and broken in a world that had forgotten her. The nightmare was over. Vance and Jacob, two men from different walks of life, two men who had been strangers just a few days ago, stood together, their eyes fixed on the empty space where the Ghost Bears had been. They had fought, and they had won, not against a mythical creature, but against a human evil that was far more terrifying than any legend. The next morning, as the snow began to melt, Vance and his men helped the McAllisters bury their dead. They had lost friends, but they had also gained something. They had gained a newfound respect for each other, a bond forged in the crucible of a shared trauma. The Ghost Bears were gone. The cult had been broken. The children were safe, but the memory of what had happened in these mountains would remain, a haunting reminder that the true monsters are not in the legends, but in the dark, twisted depths of the human heart. The mountains had their secrets, but they had given up their most terrifying one. And the world was just a little bit safer for it. The nightmare was over. The long, bloody shadow of the Ghost Bears was finally gone.